What if the voice in your head that tells you to wait, to play it safe, to quit right before the breakthrough was never actually yours? That question haunted Napoleon Hill so deeply that he wrote an entire book confessing the answer, then locked it away for more than 70 years. Hill was the author of Think and Grow Rich when he wrote Outwitting the Devil, and what he admitted inside it was far too honest for the world he lived in. Hill wrote this book after Andrew Carnegie's challenge in 1908, when the steel magnate asked a young journalist to spend 20 years interviewing history's most successful men for free. Inside these pages, Hill reveals a number the devil confessed under interview, a percentage of the human race he claims total control over, a figure most viewers will find deeply uncomfortable. Hill also describes the anonymous phone call that sent him running from his home in terror, a night we will circle to later. By the end of this video, you will understand the 7 principles Hill extracted from that encounter, the exact machinery the devil uses to keep ambitious people drifting through life half awake, and the single decision that separates the 2% who escape from the 98% who never do. If you have ever felt talented but stuck, driven but directionless, this breakdown was built for you. Subscribe now, hit like, because what comes next will change how you see your own mind. The first meeting and the awakening. Let's step back to 1908 inside Chapter 1 of this breakdown, to the room where this philosophy was born. A young journalist named Napoleon Hill sat across from Andrew Carnegie, a man whose fortune in today's money would rival roughly $370 billion, according to modern financial estimates. Carnegie made an unusual request. Instead of practicing law, Hill should spend 2 decades interviewing history's most successful men, unpaid, and distill their thinking into one unified philosophy of achievement. Carnegie's real test was not the job description itself. He wanted to know if this young man could commit to something bigger than a single lifetime. Hill said yes, and that single decision reshaped the next 20 years of his life and eventually the entire self-help genre. What most viewers do not realize is that Outwitting the Devil was written afterward, once Hill was already famous, as a private confession about how close he came to losing everything he had built. Here's the uncomfortable part. Hill was not writing this book from a place of triumph. He was writing it from nearly 2 months of paralyzing indecision, a season where he knew every principle of success in theory, but could not force himself to apply a single one of them in practice. Sound familiar? That gap between knowing and doing is exactly where the devil, as Hill calls him, does his best and quietest work. It was during this exact period of collapse that Hill claims he first learned to distinguish his own conscious thinking from something else entirely, a second voice inside his mind that seemed to answer questions before he had finished asking them. He called this discovery the beginning of a new world. What that new world revealed to him next is where the real interview and the real danger actually begins. The devil's confession and the trap of drifting. Now we move into Chapter 2, where the interview itself finally begins, and Hill meets the entity he chooses to call the devil. In the dialogue, the devil admits something staggering. He claims to control the vast majority of the human race, somewhere near 98%, while only a small remainder operates entirely outside his reach. Hill, by his own account, belonged to that narrow 2%, and he wanted to know exactly why. The devil's answer was simple and brutal. Most people are not conquered through dramatic defeat. They are conquered through drifting and endless, comfortable postponement of decisions, disguised as patience or flexibility. A drifter is someone who has good intentions but no fixed target, someone who lets circumstances choose their direction instead of choosing it themselves. The devil confessed that drifters require no effort at all to control because they have already surrendered the one thing that would protect them. This is where most viewers should stop and get honest with themselves. Not the drifter with no ambition, but the talented drifter, the one with real ability who keeps waiting for permission, motivation, or the perfect moment before acting. The Vol perspective on this is different from what most productivity content tells you. Discipline is not the opposite of drifting. Decisiveness is. A drifter can work 80-hour weeks and still be completely directionless underneath all that motion. Hill pressed the devil further, wanting to understand exactly how drifting becomes permanent, how a temporary phase of confusion calcifies into an entire wasted lifetime. The devil's answer involved a mechanism far more sophisticated than simple laziness, something closer to conditioning than choice. He called it hypnotic rhythm. And once Hill understood how it worked, he realized he had already been living inside it for years without knowing. Hypnotic rhythm and the machinery of repetition. From here, we enter Chapter 3, and this is where the mechanics get strange, but stay with it because this idea alone justifies the entire book. The devil explains that every thought a person repeats, whether fearful or confident, begins to carve a groove in the mind. Repeat it long enough and the groove becomes automatic, running on its own, requiring no further decision from you. This is hypnotic rhythm, and it works exactly the same way for failure as it does for success. The unsettling implication is that most people are not choosing their circumstances at all. They are simply running old grooves laid down years earlier by fear, criticism, or early failure, mistaking that automatic repetition for their own personality. Here's a quiet thought worth sitting with. What if the version of you that procrastinates, doubts, or plays small is not actually who you are, but simply the deepest groove anyone ever let form, one you never consciously chose in the first place? Here is where the book turns genuinely practical. If hypnotic rhythm can trap you in failure, the exact same mechanism can be deliberately redirected towards success, simply by controlling which thoughts you allow to repeat uninterrupted. Hill argues this is not positive thinking in the shallow sense most people mean. It is architecture. You're either the architect of your own rhythm, consciously choosing what gets repeated, or you are living inside a structure someone else built for you years ago. Hill admits this realization terrified him more than anything else in the entire interview because it meant the stakes were never really about willpower at all. They were about which grooves got laid down first and how early in life that shaping began. Before we go further, there is one revelation still ahead that reframes everything you have just heard, and it arrives in the very next chapter, the seeds of fear. But here's the part that should stop you cold. The fear that runs your life right now was likely planted before you were old enough to question it, and it has been compounding ever since, quietly dictating your decisions while you called it caution. Chapter 4 opens a darker room, so lean in for this one. The devil confesses that fear is not something he creates from nothing. Fear is something he simply waters, using seeds most people had planted in their own minds during childhood, long before they were old enough to question what they were being taught. Here is the sentence that should genuinely unsettle you. The devil claims he does not need to fight you at all, because most people do his work for him voluntarily. Inside the vault, we call this the seed stage, the earliest and cheapest point at which fear can be planted, because a single discouraging sentence from a parent, teacher, or authority figure can quietly outlast decades of later success. Hill traces his own fear of poverty back to specific early experiences of lack, and he insists this is universal. Nobody arrives at adulthood fear-free. The only real choice is whether you notice which seeds were planted or let them grow in the dark unquestioned. The danger, Hill explains, is that fear rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as caution, as realism, as simply being sensible. Ask yourself something uncomfortable right now. How many of your own careful, reasonable decisions were actually fear wearing a more respectable outfit? The devil admitted that this disguise is his favorite tool, precisely because it feels like wisdom from the inside, which means most people never think to fight something that feels this reasonable. Hill wanted an exit from this trap, and the devil, almost reluctantly, admitted there was exactly one countermeasure powerful enough to override every seed of fear ever planted. It was not confidence. It was not motivation. It was something far more specific and far more demanding than either, and Hill devotes the next chapter of the interview entirely to explaining what it actually requires of a person willing to use it. Definiteness of purpose, the first principle. We arrive now at Chapter 5. The principle Hill considered the master key to every other principle in the book. Definiteness of purpose. Not a vague dream, not a vision board wish, but a specific, written, relentlessly pursued target that you refuse to negotiate away when things get uncomfortable. The devil admitted that a person with true definiteness of purpose becomes almost impossible to manipulate because drifting requires ambiguity, and ambiguity is exactly what a defined purpose eliminates. Let's be blunt, because this chapter deserves bluntness. Most people who feel stuck are not lacking ability. They are lacking a target specific enough to organize their ability around. Vague purpose produces vague effort, and vague effort is functionally identical to drifting, no matter how busy it looks from the outside. Hill insists that definiteness of purpose must be backed by a plan and a willingness to sacrifice comfort, because purpose without sacrifice is simply a wish wearing a nicer name. This is the chapter where most viewers should pause the video and get specific, out loud, about what they are actually building toward. Not a category, like success or happiness, but a defined outcome with a deadline attached to it. The devil's confession makes the stakes clear. Every day that passes without that clarity is a day drifting quietly wins by default, uncontested, simply because nobody showed up to compete for that day's direction. Hill admits that discovering his own definiteness of purpose was not a peaceful moment of clarity. It came out of desperation after nearly losing everything, which raises an uncomfortable question worth carrying into the final chapter of this breakdown. Does purpose actually require a crisis to become real, or is there a way to build that same unshakable clarity before life forces your hand? The final chapter answers that question directly. Self-discipline, adversity, and the reward of mastery. This brings us to the final chapter of the breakdown, and it deserves your full attention because Hill ties every previous principle together here through self-discipline, learning from adversity, and what he calls the reward of mastery. The devil confessed that self-discipline is the only principle he genuinely cannot corrupt or fake his way around, because it is not a feeling that can be talked out of someone. It is simply a decision, repeated daily, regardless of mood. Hill also insists that adversity is never wasted, provided you extract a lesson before moving on, and for a moment the interview feels like it has reached its natural conclusion, hard-won wisdom, delivered and complete. But there is a deeper layer beneath even this, one Hill almost left out of the manuscript entirely. He reveals that mastery without harmony, without honest relationships and inner peace, quietly rebuilds the very drifting it was meant to destroy. This final principle, harmony combined with caution around who you let influence your environment and your time, is the one Hill admits took him longest to master personally. Success, he confesses, attracts new dangers that failure never does: flattery, false friends, distraction disguised as opportunity. The devil's last confession in the entire interview is almost a warning. He does his most effective work not on the way up, but after a person has already arrived. That single warning is what makes Outwitting the Devil more than a success manual. It is a maintenance manual for after you have already won. Everything Hill and the devil discussed across this entire interview, drifting, hypnotic rhythm, fear, purpose, discipline, adversity, and harmony, collapses down into 5 lessons you can actually apply starting this week, and that is exactly where we are headed next. Key lessons and insights. Find your 2%. Let's pull the first lesson out of everything we just covered. Hill's devil confessed to controlling roughly 98% of people through nothing more dramatic than drifting, disguised as patience. Remember the question we opened with about that number. Here is the resolution. The 2% who escape are not smarter or luckier. They simply made one decision the majority never makes, choosing a specific direction and refusing to renegotiate it every time life got inconvenient or uncertain. Practically, this means auditing your own life for drift disguised as patience. Are you waiting for the right moment, or are you avoiding a decision you already know you need to make? Write down one area of your life where you have been drifting for longer than you would admit out loud, and give yourself 7 days to convert that drift into a single definite decision, even an imperfect one, because imperfect direction always beats comfortable ambiguity. Audit your hypnotic rhythm. Here's the second lesson, and it's the one most people ignore because it requires actual self-observation instead of motivation. Every day, you are repeating certain thoughts about money, relationships, or your own capability, and those repetitions are quietly building a groove that will eventually run without your permission. The practical move is simple but uncomfortable. Spend 1 week noticing which sentences you repeat to yourself automatically, especially the critical ones, before you try to change anything at all. Once you can name the groove, you can begin interrupting it deliberately, replacing one repeated sentence at a time with something you have actually chosen rather than inherited. This is not about forcing false positivity. It is about ownership. In business, in relationships, in how you talk to yourself after a mistake, the goal is the same, making sure the rhythm running your mind was built by you on purpose rather than assembled by accident somewhere in your past. Name the disguise fear wears. Lesson 3 cuts a little deeper, so stay with me. Fear rarely shows up announcing itself honestly. It shows up as a reasonable-sounding excuse, a delay that feels responsible, a caution that feels wise. This week, whenever you catch yourself making a safe, sensible decision, pause and ask honestly whether fear is actually driving that choice, wearing a more respectable costume than usual. Most people never ask this question even once in their entire lives. Once named, fear loses most of its power because disguises only function while they remain unrecognized. In leadership, this looks like finally having the difficult conversation you have been framing as timing. In money, It looks like making the investment or the ask you have been calling premature. The practical exercise is small. Choose one decision you have postponed under the label of caution and give yourself 48 hours to make it honestly instead. Write one sentence of definite purpose. Now for the fourth lesson, the one that changes how you plan your week, not just your year. Hill's principle of definiteness of purpose only works when it is specific enough to organize daily decisions around, not vague enough to feel inspiring but useless. This week, write one sentence describing exactly what you are building with a deadline attached, then read that sentence every morning before you check a single message or notification. That single sentence becomes your filter for every decision that follows. Does this opportunity, relationship, or habit move me closer to that sentence, or does it quietly pull me back into drifting? Business decisions get sharper this way. Relationships clarify. Even small daily choices, like how you spend your first hour of the morning, start organizing themselves around one clear target instead of scattering across whatever felt urgent when you woke up. Guard your harmony after you win. And here is the fifth and final lesson, the one that ties everything together, and it is the one ambitious people ignore most often. Success is not in the devil's influence. According to Hill, it simply changes his method. After you win, the danger shifts from fear and drifting toward flattery, false friendships, and distraction disguised as new opportunity. Guarding your harmony, your inner peace, and honest relationships becomes the real work once external success has already arrived. The practical application here is periodic honesty, not paranoia. Once a month, look at who has entered your life since your last success and ask whether they add clarity or quietly encourage new drifting dressed up as relaxation you have earned. Protecting your purpose does not stop once you reach it. If anything, this is the exact point where most people, having finally arrived, quietly hand the wheel back to the devil without ever noticing they did it. The vault closing. What makes Outwitting the Devil different from every other success book on your shelf is that Hill was not writing as a guru looking down at struggling people. He was writing as someone who had nearly lost everything, admitting in private exactly how close he came to becoming another drifter himself. If you leave with nothing else from this video, let it be this. The devil Hill describes was never external. It was the version of himself willing to settle. Remember the anonymous phone call we opened this video with, the one that sent Hill running from his home in genuine terror? That night is exactly why this book exists. Hill later said that fear nearly ended his work permanently, and it was only by confronting what actually frightened him that he found the clarity to keep going. Your 7-day action is simple. Name the one fear you have been treating as permanent, and take one concrete action against it before the week ends. Outwitting the Devil was never really about a literal devil. It was about the quiet, reasonable-sounding voice that talks ambitious people out of their own lives, one small postponement at a time. Recognize it, name it, and refuse to let it write your next decade. If this breakdown gave you something real to work with, like this video, subscribe for more strategic breakdowns like this one, and comment below with the one takeaway you are applying first.